Hello, I'm Father Charlie Bouchard, and I'm here to offer you a few words to help you know more about the scriptures before you go to hear them at Mass on this coming Sunday, the 11th Sunday in Ordinary Time. Everybody, of course, loves a story, and there are some stories that are so appealing to people that they survive in the popular imagination for years or decades or even centuries. One of those stories in American culture is The Wizard of Oz. It was originally written as a novel about the year 1900, and at that time there was also a pretty significant financial crisis going on in the US, mainly having to do with the value and the stability of the dollar. And some enterprising person took the story of The Wizard of Oz and created this elaborate allegory to make a point. For example, in the book, Dorothy's shoes are silver rather than ruby. So the allegory said that the silver slippers were really meant to be the silver standard. The yellow brick road became the gold standard. The Emerald City became paper money, and so on and so forth. Each part of that story was assigned a symbolic meaning, which was then used to convey that author's viewpoint about the solution to the fiscal crisis that was plaguing the United States. Now, these kinds of allegories are very common. We find them in all kinds of movies and stories where one thing stands for something else, and sometimes everything has an allegorical meaning. But when we look at the parables, two of which we encounter in the scriptures today, which we frequently do, we find a different kind of story. A parable is different from an allegory because it's much more complicated, a little bit oblique, and maybe even obscure. It can be very hard to understand what point Jesus is really trying to make when he tells these parabolic stories. In fact, in today's gospel, it says that he only spoke to the people in parables, probably because he felt that at that time they weren't going to be able to understand, but that he did take time to explain the parable to his disciples because even they weren't getting the point many times. And in these two parallels today, we've really got two different stories. And even though parables usually have several different elements, there's usually just one point that the parable is trying to make. I think in the first one, the parable of the sower, where the seed is sown by we don't know who, it doesn't say God, it doesn't say it's a human person, that seed is sown and begins to grow even without our knowing or being aware of it. And I think that Jesus is trying to say here that the kingdom of God is already planted among us and even in us and has begun to grow and develop. It is organic. In other words, it's not a foreign thing that's imposed on us like a harsh chemical, but it is something that finds a natural home in human life and in creation. And the second parable today about the one that talks about the seed, the tiny mustard seed, is similar. It could mean a lot of different things, and it doesn't totally make logical sense. For one thing, the mustard seed was not the smallest seed, even in Jesus' time. There were other plants that had smaller seeds. Secondly, the mustard seed did not grow into a great tree that would support all kinds of creatures and birds, and some versions of the Bible still translate it today as the biggest tree. Rather, it grew into a bush, perhaps a big one, but not anything dramatic or overwhelming. It was big and bushy, but the mustard plant is almost like a weed. It grows everywhere, and it's very hard to eradicate, very hard to get rid of. And that's probably something important for us to think about. If we imagine the reign of God to really be something very tiny, which grows anywhere and becomes big and bushy, what does that say about the kingdom of God in our own world? And plus, if it's very hard to eradicate like a weed, that says something as well, that the kingdom of God growing in our midst is very durable and it doesn't easily give way to our efforts by sin, perhaps, to destroy it or to put it aside. Now, when we think of that idea of the mustard seed becoming a big bush, we think, that isn't a very elegant or impressive image for the reign of God. We might think of something like the cedars, the enormous cedars that are described in the first reading today, something tall and majestic and old, something that lasts forever, that's very hard. Whenever I hear that passage, I think of perhaps the sequoias or the redwoods in California, which many of you have seen. They are enormous, they're majestic. Wouldn't that be a better image for the reign of God? Or I think of the Douglas firs that grow on Victoria Island in British Columbia. They grow in a place called Cathedral Canyon because the trees are so tall and so enormous. One of them, the oldest one, which may be 800 years old, has a circumference of 27 feet. Why wouldn't we take one of those trees to be an image of the reign of God? And I think perhaps the reason is that those enormous trees only grow in certain circumstances and only in a couple places on the earth. And I think when he uses the image of the mustard seed and the mustard bush, Jesus is trying to say that this plant can grow anywhere, that it is a tiny seed, but it can flourish even in the tiny crack in a sidewalk. It can grow from that. And I think what he's trying to say is that the kingdom of God doesn't need this special nurturing or care, that it can really flourish any place in human existence, even in places that we wouldn't think would be very hospitable, like, for example, sometimes our own hearts or the hearts of sinners. They too can give birth or can be a home to this reign of God, which is durable and which grows into this great bush and provides shelter and a home for other creatures. So perhaps today, as we hear these two parables, we could give a little thought to two corresponding questions. The first one is, where have I experienced the growth of the reign of God in the world or in my own heart? I often think of people who work in social justice advocacy, who go into the missions, who go out and protest against injustice. I think often they must feel the presence and the growth of that kingdom within them as they are preaching for these values of justice. I've also seen it in healthcare providers and even in patients who exhibit enormous strength and courage and skill in making the reign of God, that gift of healing and peace, available and give it a place to live. Or maybe what little tiny thing, like that little tiny mustard seed, where do we see that growing in ourselves? Are there any little seeds in us that need to be recognized and nurtured so that they're able to grow? Sometimes we know that something's happening within us. It's a very small voice, a small action, a small event, and we kind of back away from it because we're not ready. But let's take time to think about those little things in our lives and ask that God will open our eyes to see what those little manifestations of the reign of God are and how we can nourish them and enable them to grow.